I am so excited that we are into season 3 of my podcast, Stories of Unconscious Bias. When I first began this podcast, I had no idea that it would take off. I began it because I genuinely want more people to listen, reflect, and learn about how our life experiences can influence us in ways that we cannot begin to imagine. Due to the wonderful candid stories my speakers have shared, I now know that my podcast is ranked in the top 5% globally. I want to thank all my speakers for this huge achievement. As always, if you enjoy it, please do share, rate, and review. Thank you for listening. This interview came about through serendipity. A friend of mine loaned me a book under the promise that I return it to her as she loved it so much. It's called Under the Camelthorn Tree by Kate Nicholls. I read it not knowing anything at all about it. It's about Kate raising her 5 children in Botswana, about their attachment to lions, about homeschooling them, and so much more. Without going into any more specifics, as I want you all to read it too, it gripped me from the start and moved me at so many levels. I was determined to interview Kate for my podcast so that more of us could hear her stories and wisdom. I should warn listeners that what Kate talks about includes experience of sexual abuse as a child and an adult and how these have shaped her. Kate is currently running a homeschool business in Rome and is passionate about integrated education. She's also writing her second book, which I hope she's going to tell us a little bit more about. Welcome, Kate, and thank you so much for joining me to share your stories of unconscious bias.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here with you.
So, Kate, straight off, as I do with all my interviewees, these 2 words, unconscious bias, what do they mean to you?
They mean, I think a bias is a preference that's either based on past experience or from learned experience, learned from our environment. And I think this is what I'm finding so fascinating about unconscious bias is what are our own biases, or what are the biases that we have inherited as a meme? And I've got an example of this. My beloved mum, please don't think I'm being critical or blamey of her at all. I'm not. But she had a very strong bias against exploring your personal past, exploring your childhood. Now, I didn't understand that, of course, this sprang from her own experience, but I absorbed it unconsciously as a bias. And, she would say things like, oh, darling, whining about people who whine about their past or drone on about their childhood is terribly self-indulgent. And I absorbed that unconsciously. And I was gloriously released, I'm happy to say, in my 30s by a theatre director. I was playing Kate in The Taming of the Shrew. And the director gave me a book by Alice Miller called The Roots of Violence in Child Rearing. And there are 3 books that have changed the trajectory of my life, and this is one of them. And when I read it, Alice Miller acted for the first time as an advocate for me and my experience as a child who had been sexually abused in nursery school. So at a time when I was pretty much wordless. And I had sucked in this experience and stored it away. And Alice Miller acted as my guide, really. Took a long time. She also acted as an advocate for my children, because when I read it, I had got 4 of my 5 children, and the oldest was 10 and the youngest was 2 at that time. And she helped me to better understand how a child perceives the world, how a children's relationships with the truth. She offered me a She offered me a pathway. She offered me guidance, and it's guidance that I keep to this day. And I went home very practically, and I lined up my little people on the sofa, which I always did if there was something terribly important, a family meeting, and they lined up like little Russian dolls. And I took the book and I said, "This is written by a woman who loves all children and is absolutely always on your side. And I'm going to put this book on the lowest bookshelf so you can all reach it. And if ever you think that I've been unfair or something doesn't feel right and you don't have the words to express it and you feel in a muddle, go and get the book, bring it to me, and we will work it out. I'll know I've made a mistake." And we did that, my darling. It was extraordinary. They never used it if I was sending them to bed or, do your teeth or pick wet towels off the floor. They never bothered. They only used it for important things. And they didn't use it that often. But my goodness, when they did, it was powerful.
Gosh, there are so many things you've just said, Kate, that my head is reeling, and I'm just going to, for my listeners' sake and for my own sake, I want to try and capture what you've said, summarize what you've said, so it gets us even more meaning. I mean, certainly the one aspect of what you talked about in terms of unconscious bias, you talk about the fact that all of us, you and me included, often without realizing it, follow through unconsciously because of what our parents have said to us.
Mm-hmm.
So mom says, "Oh, stop whining," and so on, and we just think that's how it should be.
Mm.
And and then something you just threw in very gently was the fact that you had child abuse when you were in a nursery school. You were abused,
Mm.
and of course, because I'm trying and putting two and two together, because of how you were parented at the time, you just decided, of course, you can't talk about it, you'll just bury it. But of course, burying it had its own outcome, because it then impacted on how you were behaving with your own children.
Yeah,
Um,
and I think this chance, when you say, by chance, I mean, yeah, I hate to think what would have happened had I not read this book and had that guidance. I absolutely don't blame my mum. When I spoke to her about it, and I said, did my behavior change? Because it didn't just happen once. Um, uh, and
so may
I
I
went
forgive
and
me for asking, when you say abuse, are we talking sexual abuse? Are we
yes,
talking
sexual
physical?
abuse within the school, and there were two teachers. No, it was not. It was grim, um, but of course, because I was a little person, uh, I believed when my mum took me to school every day um, that's where I should be, and that was, and I do remember. Uh, I remember what I call going into the black, where everything shut down and went very dark. And this would happen to me throughout my life. My safe place was under a table. Um, and these were very visceral body experiences that happened to me. I also was a furious child.
Mm.
And I spoke to my mum and I said to her, "Darling, you know, when did my behavior change?" And she said, "Yes, it did. You got very cross and you were really quite difficult." And of course, in those days, if you had a difficult child, the right thing to do is to discipline them. They weren't thinking in those days, as we do now, that maybe this is a troubled child. So our whole attitudes have changed. And again, she had unconscious biases. So as I say, it's terribly important that we unravel our own unconscious biases and unravel the unconscious biases that have been imposed upon us. Um, and and I found this, it really helped me with my own children. Um, and this was carried on in all sorts of ways. I believe that school is very much part of the community. I think it's really important that we have an egalitarian education system. I did have a conscious bias against, say, boarding schools, private schools, until my oldest son was diagnosed dyslexic when he was 9, severely dyslexic. And we were told not to expect very much of him academically. What a terrible thing to say to somebody when they're 9. I mean, how ridiculous. I'm very dyslexic. My father is it's right in the family. So it wasn't a surprise. And there was no support within the state at that time in the county that we were in. This has changed now, happily. And so we sent him to a little school. It was a private school that supported specifically dyslexic children. And oh my goodness, my biases were ripped away. I saw such humanity, such kindness, such emotional intelligence at play. And it was a school started by an American lawyer. And I believe he must have been a transcendentalist, because the school reminded me of Little Men. And remember, I spoke about 3 books that changed my life. When I read Little Men as a child by Louisa M. Alcott, where she describes this school it's a fictional school, but it's based on the reality of her father's school. And Amos Alcott was one of the great transcendentalists. And I thought, this is what a school should be. This is what learning should be. We learn all day. It's not just in class. We learn in the garden. We learn at the table. We learn sitting around the fire. And I was not happy at school, not because I wasn't a friendly child. I had lovely friends and I liked the teachers. I just felt that there was something fundamentally wrong. But
I'm nodding away listening to you, and I'm thinking about learning and how your 5 children learned, because of the fact that you were no longer sitting in a private school in London. You decided, I'm going to go and do some research on lions. And you
yeah,
packed your 5 children and you went off to Botswana.
I
So
did.
tell us about that kind of
Indeed.
learning. What did that look like?
Well, this is interesting because I realized that, thinking about this, I realized that a lack of confidence could be considered an unconscious bias against oneself, because I had an unconscious bias that I couldn't possibly teach my children. And I think now, in the days of COVID, there are a lot of parents who may recognize that. And yet I did put them to school in Botswana. They weren't happy, and for a variety of reasons, I experimented and I started teaching them myself. And the experiment worked because we did it for 11 years. And our school was under a tree in the Okavango Delta, and our classes were interrupted by lion kills and elephants. Yes, for sure, that made, our circumstances were very unusual, but the guiding principles weren't. It was academically, it was strong, but what was exciting was learning from the children and seeing children learning as children have learned for millennia in classes with lots of different age groups. I mean, Oakley was 2 and he would potter around and join science classes and listen to the story. He didn't officially join the table until he was 7, but it was they would buddy teach. Each of them had different skills and talents and gifts, so they would support each other, as children do in any village.
And this is what you were saying about integrated learning, isn't it? And our
Yes.
unconscious bias is that education has to be so from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. or whatever, 4
Yeah.
p.m. And then you go and play. But of course, wherever you are, whatever time of the day,
Yeah.
we are learning. And you said
Yes.
another thing which I thought was very important, the fact that you adult are learning from the children just as much as the children are learning from you, the adult who happens to also be the teacher at that point in time in the Okavango Desert with the lions and the elephants. And I
Yeah.
think that's what makes it very interesting, this whole idea of what does homeschooling even mean then?
It's so important that we learn from the children. I've got a little anecdote about that. They wrote a book called The Lion Children, which was published by Orion. And the editor came out to camp, bless her heart, and she worked with each child individually. They each had their own, they each wrote a part of each chapter. And she treated them as she would treat adult authors. But she was astonished, and when she gave them some advice or asked a question or said, okay, don't assume the reader knows what an impala is, for example. Give me the essence of impala. And then an hour later, there would be a little paragraph. And she looked at me, she goes, what? And I said, no, Don, this is what teaching a child is. This is how you ask them to do that. They're going to be really excited about that. And then interestingly, towards the end, it took them a year to write the book. And she rang me once in a real paddy and said, oh my God, the last chapter, it's not the same. It's like different writers. And I said, of course it is, my darling. They've been learning for a year. They've grown. Children make quantum leaps. And you have been an amazing guide. And she had not encountered that before, how we learn from children and how children learn from us. And she said she said it had been the most exciting editorial journey of her life.
No, I think it's absolutely wonderful. And especially as you said just a minute ago, you and I are speaking during COVID. And we know, I mean, your children are adults, as are mine now, but there are many parents all over the world with young school-going children who until very recently, certainly in the UK until very recently, they couldn't go to school.
Yep.
And so March, April, May, June, and then July, August, supposedly summer holidays, these children were being homeschooled by their parents, whatever that looked like. And certainly some parts of the country, certainly I know in America, there are still many parts of the US where schools have not reopened. And so it's been wonderful for them to hear your stories and for them to appreciate how important it is for us to overcome this whole idea and notion and our unconscious biases of what homeschooling could look like.
And I think having a school which is a hub in a community, but also homeschooling as well, I think that is so important. And that is my dream, that we have an integrated program and that all topics are integrated. I was raised in a literary family. All my family are actors. I used to be an actor. And that was joyful, and reading was a very important part of our family life. But science, much less so. Indeed, my beloved mum viewed scientists with quite a considerable degree of suspicion. One of her mantras was, my darling, all scientists should be made to read Shakespeare. The assumption being that they hadn't. And I shared my dad's interest, and when on the moon landing, I remember I was just so excited, I can't tell you. It was the most wonderful thing. It inspired me. And I remember pouring a thermos of tomato soup and grabbing lots of digestive biscuits and not going to the loo so I wouldn't miss a minute of it. And the next day, I was watching my mum standing at the window looking up at the moon, and she turned to me and she said, oh, my darling, the moon has been defiled. Exactly that. Well, darling, it's hysterical. And I remember thinking, are you barking, my mummy? This is the most exciting thing in the world. Man has stood on that. But to her, it was a horror. And she would say, all scientists must read Shakespeare. Well, the implication being that none of them had. And so I was raised with this bias, and gloriously, one day I read a book sitting on a train I will never forget as long as I live, an autumn afternoon, misty, cold. And I opened The Extended Phenotype by Richard Dawkins, which I had bought because they'd run out of stock for The Selfish Gene, his most famous book. And so I thought, oh, well, I'll read anything by him. It was life-changing for me. I remember reading it and the hairs on my arm standing up like they do when you read a great poem that you don't quite understand, but it touches your soul. And I read it, and then I studied everything that I could, GCSE biology, A-level biology. I then went to the Bodleian and read every single scientific paper in the bibliography until I got stuck, and I wrote to him, and very, very sweetly, he offered to teach me. And it turned my life around, because here was somebody who was offering me a view of the world that I had known instinctively was there, but I didn't know where to find it. And he integrated science and literature and art and history and all the things that are beautiful and poetic about humankind. And this is something, I've just had a class now with a child who said to me, I'm very surprised. I've just done a little test to see what I might be interested in as I get older. And apparently I might be interested in microbiology, but I don't like biology. I only like physics. And I just rolled about laughing. And I said, my darling, you have in one sentence summed up everything that's wrong about teaching science. Your body obeys the laws of physics. You are a chemical factory. Biology, physics, and chemistry are all intertwined. It's only comparatively recently that we have separated these disciplines, and gloriously they're starting to come together. Biologists, ecologists, the very first were farmers. You know, we are all of us scientists. You know, think about fermentation and bread rising and baking a cake, and we need to embrace science as part of the arts, and that with the arts we don't need to put literature on the top and dance at the bottom, and we don't need to talk about soft subjects and hard subjects. Let's see the whole glorious picture.
That is brilliant, because I mean, I certainly remember as a child, I would tell anybody who was willing to listen, I hate chemistry. And to some degree, I'm ashamed to say that I believe, even though I don't know any better, that I am no good at chemistry. I mean, what does that even mean? And
Well,
it
what
is
does it exactly?
the listeners will be saying, oh, I know, you know, the point that you are making is so powerful, because we are brought up, it doesn't matter where in the world we're brought up, but when we think about education, we put them into compartments. And
Yes.
we have locks on each of these doors, and we open one door, we go in, come home, lock that door, then you open the next door. Whereas what you're saying is cancel all that unconscious biases that we
Yes.
might have about education, and
Oh my
put them all
goodness.
in one big fat room or one big fat box or whatever you like.
Absolutely. But I think, you know, we do extraordinary things like try and teach 6-year-olds very abstract concepts like adverbs and adjectives, and we insist that they need to understand this. A child of 6 is really excited if they learn about the atomic structure of hydrogen and helium. And all you need to do is to get a helium balloon, and all they need to be able to do is count to 2. And they have embraced a profound concept. You tell them that every single atom in their body is made in the stars. The wonder in their little faces. That's what we need to be doing. Then you invite children into the sciences rather than teach them about the periodic table when they're 14, when they don't care. And actually, it's the most wonderful, intuitive, imaginative piece of genius. It's
I mean,
poetry.
it just hearing you is getting me all excited. Just to hear the passion in your voice, Kate. And I just want to, before I ask you for your life lessons on you know, all these various experiences that you've had, I've just kind of realized that you've talked about education, you've talked about homeschooling, you've talked about child abuse and how you overcame that. But in that, there is a thread that's going through all of that, which is also about parenting, and how we as parents could so easily, without realizing it, embed unconscious biases in our children. And
Yes.
instead, it is about acknowledging our own unconscious biases,
Yes.
whether it's our own traumatic stories that we might have had as our children ourselves,
Mm-hmm.
or whether it's something we believed from because our parents said it, or whether it's, oh God, I hate chemistry and I'm good at maths, or what.
Yes.
It doesn't matter which example I choose, but there is that thread that you have said that is running through all of it, which is very, very powerful. But so life lessons, Kate, what kind of life lessons do you tell yourself, or how do you manage your own
Well,
unconscious biases?
I think there's one word, and it's listen. um, I think it's really, really important that we listen to each other. My mind gets changed constantly because I listen and somebody tells me something that I hadn't thought of before, or something that I have thought of before, but they introduce another perspective. I hadn't looked at it from that particular angle. I think keeping talking and listening to the young is really, really important. Um, I think this blend, we need the young and the old. There's a glorious place where in Holland, where young students are offered free board and lodging in an old people's home. And what they need to do is to do a bit of shopping for the older people or sit and chat to them. The benefit to both parties is profound. Um, and isn't it sad that that needs to be introduced in some form of system? In a village, that's how it works. The old and the young work together. So listening, keeping your ears and eyes open, and keep learning.
And keep
Don't
learning.
say I'm bad at science, or I'm bad at, or I don't like poetry. Keep learning. I've just been studying quantum physics. I thought I was going to really struggle. I did struggle, but my gosh, is it to open my eyes to new things. And it's wonderful.
So listen and continue to have the curiosity, no matter how old you are and where
Yeah,
you are in your life. And that is what is so
yeah.
brilliant. Kate Nicholls, this is absolutely wonderful. I want to just tell the listeners finally before we kind of sign off that I would love all the listeners to go out there now and get Under the Camelthorn Tree and read that, because you will hear so much more about Kate's passion in that book. But Kate, I know you're writing another book. So are you allowed to tell us just a sneak peek about what that's going to be about?
Yeah, it's a little sneak peek, and the principle behind it is um, we carry our own story and other people's stories in our heads, and trying to unravel that. And so my mother's life, as she narrated it to me, is carried in images in my head, but they're not my stories. So I've got to unravel what are her stories from my stories. And to be paying attention to this is really, really important. And paying attention to this with one's own children is really important. This is my story. This is what happened to me. It didn't happen to you. It's impacted on you in some way, but keep open about it. My choices are not your choices, and they're not always the right ones.
In other words, you're writing a book about unconscious bias,
I am.
which
Without
is brilliant.
unconsciously,
I
yes.
can't wait to read it. Kate Nicholls, thank you so much. It was such fun hearing the passion and the energy and the absolute wisdom about so many different aspects of your experience and your learning that you have had. So, Kate, thank you so much for sharing your stories of unconscious bias.
Thank you. It was a joy.
I could have ended the podcast there, but people who have read Kate's book, Under the Camelthorn Tree, know that from about chapter 2 onwards, Kate is suggesting that something fairly important happens to her. And by the time we have finished reading the book, we know what that is and how it defines Kate for the rest of her life. I should warn you again that this part of the episode comes with a content warning as Kate shares her experiences of further sexual violence. So, what I'm going to do, Kate, is to ask you, if you don't mind, to share that story with us.
Yes, what happened was that I got raped when I was living in Botswana by three young men on the side of a road at knife point. And the inevitably, the impact of that was catastrophic. And over the years, since I've been able to look back on not only the event, but what happened to me and my family afterwards. And I have learnt a tremendous amount. And I've learnt a tremendous amount about my own unconscious bias and other people's, and the impact that that had
on me. And I wrote the book because I wanted to write a book that explored an area that we don't particularly want to talk about, and show how it impacts on real life, family life. And I mean, earlier on, somebody once asked me, you know, I was living in Africa, you know, were they Botswana? Who cares? The colour of somebody's skin is of no interest at all. If this is a crime that is committed by men across the world, in all cultures, in all states, under all circumstances. So that was the least of my worries. The shock to me was the impact that it had, that I broke as catastrophically as I did. And I guess that was my unconscious bias. I think that was my naivety. I had kind of put it aside. You know, it was something that happened to other women. I was very surprised by other women's response. One of my daughters were just unfailingly amazing, and one of my oldest and dearest friends got on the next plane. So I had very powerful female support. But overall, women were quite judgy. Some were angry. And there was a lot of, what were you doing? Where were you going? Why were you walking? Well, I'm bipedal. I'm sorry, excuse me. You know, there seemed to be lots and lots of ways in which the responsibility was placed on me. And it took me a long time to understand. But when I did, it was a revelation, and their blame was actually fear reversed. If they could convince themselves that they would never have walked on that road or left at that time or done whatever it may be, they were therefore safe. Once I realized that, it's actually quite a simple realization, it took me a long time to get there. It made me feel very compassionate towards the blamers, because if you understand why people blame the victims, then you can maybe help them. The other thing that was maybe my unconscious bias, maybe, you know, I'd always perceived myself as a strong woman. I am a strong woman, and I've coped with some pretty significant adversity in my life, with pragmatism and, you know, a degree of humanity. But this one stripped me not only of my humanity, it stripped me of my motherhood, it stripped me of me, and that was very, very surprising. And I have come to understand why it is.
There are a couple of things I just want to respond to in this, because I'm trying to get my head around this enormity. I mean, I've read the book, but of course our listeners have not. And the one point that you've just made, which is about this fear, and the fear of our unconscious bias, people who have not had the same experience, people who have not been raped, then puts the blame on the other individual who has been raped. This fear is their unconscious bias that comes out in the way they speak, is what you're saying.
Yes, definitely. And they defend themselves by going, well, I wouldn't have done that. Why did you walk there? Why did you leave at that time? Why, you know, other, you know, one of the questions that most women who have been raped are asking, what were you wearing? What does it matter what you're wearing? You know, you really, nobody chooses their outfit and goes, oh, well, okay, that'll be fine, I'll wear this. I do run the risk of being raped if I do. I mean, it's nonsense. It's a nonsense question. But we ask these kind of nonsense questions are asked because they protectors. Oh, well, then if I don't wear that, and if I don't walk there, and if I don't do this, then I will make myself safe. And therefore, in some way, she is complicit. And one has to understand that, because these were good women. These were lovely women. These were women who were my friends. These were not horrible, baddie people. They were just scared. And therefore they weren't able to rally. Interestingly, my male friends were much better, much more able to, because it was less personal to them. And I think I know that women and men too, when you are making love and somebody enters your body, this is a very, very profound and glorious piece of intimacy. And within a relationship, or there are times when you may want to say no, because it opens up. There's a wonderful poem that I've read recently by John O'Donoghue, and he describes the wound window left open since childhood. And sometimes intense sexual lovemaking can open up these wounds, and you go, oh, no, I'm going to stop now because this has the potential to be painful. So there are beautiful, there's a network, a neural network in our bodies that I remember all my lovemaking. It's imprinted on my body, in my memory systems and in my nerves and in my hormones. Same with my childbirths. So when you are raped, in the same orifice, the same nerve endings are triggered, and this delicate, beautiful network that you have had crashes and resonates at very, very high frequency and explodes, breaks. Your internal landscape is destroyed, and all the things that you have held onto in the past, all the things that have acted as footholds, have gone. So you're left with this sort of slippery slope, up which you clamber and down which you slide. And healing is messy. I was very angry, but I didn't focus my anger in the right direction, because I'd exploded, because all the points of reference, my personal wisdoms and compassions and kindness and experience was all crumbled and fragmented on the floor. I ended up being angry with the people I loved the most, my children, and remained really quite sanguine towards the three men who had perpetrated that crime. That's an indication of how very, very muddled I was, and for very prolonged times. We are subconsciously biased, I think, against any kind of fragmentation and mental illness, because all of us live, an inch away from madness. We are fragile creatures. And so when we are with somebody who has clearly broken, another way to defend ourselves is to go, well, why is it taking them so long? Why are they behaving like this? I remember somebody saying to me, you're so angry, Kate. Nobody can help you when you're angry. Well, I didn't know what to say to that. Do you mean that you can only help me if I'm lying on the sofa, dabbing the corner of my eyes with a lacy hanky? Because that makes me more appealing. I'm sorry. Healing is messy, and it's ugly, and it's Sisyphean, and you go up, down, one. It's a very, very big muddle, and we need to be a lot more compassionate, I think, towards that. But I understand why people aren't.
There are some beautiful, moving things that you've said here, and so much of it that I'm just kind of pausing, because I think the listener would like to pause with me to I mean, honestly, because It's just, the whole idea of the beauty. I am a mother. And the whole idea of the beauty of sex, of lovemaking, and the beauty of giving birth. And then, of course, the fact that that same orifice, that area is used for some other purpose.
Yeah.
And therefore, what you said, and I forgive me, but I can't quote you, but how that the wiring of your inner soul disintegrates.
Yes.
And I'm wanting us listeners to understand what this means to us as human beings. When something so catastrophic happens, how do we then, outwardly we look just the same, but of course the wiring is gone and it has to be rebuilt. And that could be manifesting in so many different ways. And for you, it showed in anger.
Yes.
And it made you very angry. It's somebody else. It could be something else. But it's about that, though.
Yes. I think you put your finger on it. Absolutely. We're quite demanding of, bereavement has stages, and when when you're divorced, there are stages. We're quite prescriptive about how people should recover from things, and of course everybody's different. And I was making very good progress, like things, and then something else happened which ripped my life apart, and my healing was ripped up with it. Life goes on. I think certainly with why I wrote the book is that I wanted to write a book about a mother who had been raped, because the secondary victims of that crime were my children, because they lost the person who had been their rock. They lost the person that they knew and trusted, and they were bewildered by my behavior. And that, I think that is the long-term tragedy of the crime. My recovery happened, and then my children needed to recover, and they could only start that journey properly, safely for themselves once I was better, once they got me back. So it's a very, very, very brutal crime, and we need to be thinking about the fact, women who are in refugee camps, women who are living in isolation. My youngest child was 8, and my Maisie was 14, and the boys were 16, 17, and Emily was 21. She had just had her own baby, 22. So they were all different ages, and it hit them in different ways. It couldn't have. There is no ideal time for any of those kind of things. Each one of them was profoundly impacted by it, and they were wonderful. So without question, they got me through it. I mean, they were relentlessly kind and loving until they couldn't take it anymore. And that's one of the things in the book, is that they all had their own personal limit to it. Took longer than they could bear. And that is something that I think we all need to be, again, very compassionate about. I think helping the carers is really, really, really important. When somebody is recovering from an illness or a breakdown or whatever it may be, if we can help the carers, we therefore are helping the person who needs it. And
that's very, very important for us to hear, because again, when we're thinking about something like rape, we don't put the same stories and expectations into it. And all 5 of them were supporting you in their own way. Whether you were 8 or whether you were 16 is besides the point.
Yeah.
And of course, each child was at a different level of their maturity.
Exactly.
But they needed support to be carers.
100%. And there was somebody who did something, very often people say, what can I do? And the thing you can do is to support the supporter, is to support the carers. And there was my 14-year-old daughter had a friend who lived with her dad, who is a wonderful, darling, kind man. And he ran one of the local garages, and he just took Maisie in. He knew that she needed a break from me. He also, what he did, it brings tears to my eyes just thinking about it. He not only supported and loved my daughter and gave her sanctuary, he did so with no judgment to me. He knew exactly how much I loved my daughter, how much I loved my children, and what I was going through. And he knew how he could help me. And it was beautiful. And I've never, ever, ever forgotten it. And knowing that your girl is snuggled in and safe and having a happy time and being well looked after soothed me and made it easier for me to deal with the next day. So there are lots of things that can be done. But there is I've talked to you earlier about this poem, and that there is, I don't want to be romantic about this. I'm not for 1 minute saying, oh, I'm glad it happened to me. It taught me so much. I desperately wish it hadn't, because it took away wonderful time with my children. But at the end of this poem, which is written by called John Donahue, and it's to someone who did you wrong. At the very end of the poem, he says, now a new kindness seems to have entered time, and I can see how that hurt has schooled my heart in a compassion I would otherwise have never learned. And when I read that,
Could you read that again, Kay? That is so moving.
Now a new kindness seems to have entered time, and I can see how that hurt has schooled my heart in a compassion I would otherwise have never learned. And it's yeah, my heart was certainly schooled by what I learned. I wouldn't wish anybody to learn that lesson that way, but I think it's helpful for those of us that have to share them.
Oh, Kate Nicholls, I am honoured that you have shared this story, because I know that listeners hearing this will get so much out of it. Kate Nicholls, thank you so very much for sharing this story with me. Thank you for listening to my podcast, Stories of Unconscious Bias. If you enjoyed hearing this episode, do tune in every Saturday for a new interview. And if you could share, leave a review and rating, that would be hugely appreciated. You can find me on Instagram and Twitter @Smita Tharoor, and feel free to suggest new guests. Until next week.